Nothing cuts deeper than being forgotten by those who once called you family. Sometimes the loneliest place in the world isn't an empty room, but a crowded hall where no one meets your eyes. In the great mead-hall of Jorvikstead, wedding guests feast and laugh around long wooden tables. But one seat sits apart from the rest. Freya Ljosdottir watches the celebration alone, her uncle's disgrace hanging over her like a dark cloud. The other women dance with warriors and laugh with their friends. No one speaks to Freya. No one even looks her way. Then heavy footsteps approach her table. Hrolf Thundertamer, a giant of a man with battle scars and kind eyes, stops beside her chair. He leans down and whispers 4 words that will change everything. Act like you're with me. But what happens? When pretending starts to feel real. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The torchlight flickered across the carved wooden pillars of Jorvikstead's great mead-hall, casting dancing shadows that seemed to mirror the whispered conversations echoing through the vast space. This was where the clans gathered, where alliances were forged and broken, where honor was earned and lost. Tonight it served as witness to the wedding of Thorvald, Ironbeard's eldest daughter to a merchant's son from the eastern settlements, a union that would strengthen trade routes and fill coffers with silver. Freya Ljosdottir had chosen her seat carefully, at a table near the wall where the light barely reached, close enough to appear present, far enough to avoid unwanted attention. The rough-hewn bench felt cold beneath her simple woolen dress, dyed the color of autumn leaves, once fine enough for a jarl's niece, now faded and mended more times than she cared to count. Her fingers traced the rim of her pewter cup, untouched ale growing warm as the evening wore on. The silver wedding goblet passed from hand to hand among the honored guests at the high table, each taking a ceremonial drink to bless the union. It would never reach her table. Such symbols of belonging were no longer hers to share. 3 months had passed since her uncle Bjorn Treacherous Heart, as they now called him, had been executed for his betrayal of King Harald's trust. 3 months since the Jarl's broken seal ring had been cast into the fire, its silver melting into shapeless ruin, just as her family's honor had melted away. The accusations still burned in her memory: stolen grain meant for the king's armies, secret dealings with Danish raiders, whispered plans to overthrow the rightful order. Bjorn had denied it all, even as they dragged him to the execution stone. But the evidence had been overwhelming. Documents bearing his seal, witnesses who swore they had seen him meeting with enemy agents, gold coins found hidden in his chambers. The king's justice had been swift and absolute, and Freya, as his only surviving relative, had inherited more than his lands and livestock. She had inherited his shame. The laughter from the high table grew louder as another round of mead was poured. Jarl Eric Goldbeard raised his drinking horn in yet another toast, his booming voice carrying across the hall. To young love that blooms like spring flowers after winter's hard frost. The assembled guests roared their approval, horns and cups thrust skyward. Freya lifted her own cup half-heartedly, going through the motions. She had loved weddings once, had dreamed of her own celebration in this very hall. Now such dreams felt as distant as the stars visible through the smoke hole above. "Look how she sits there, bold as brass," came a whispered voice from the table behind her. Astrid the gossip, wife to a minor landowner, never missed a chance to sharpen her tongue. "After what her uncle did, she should have the grace to stay home, the blood tells," replied another woman's voice. "Treachery runs in that line like a poisoned stream." Freya's jaw tightened, but she kept her eyes fixed on her cup. Rising to defend herself would only give them more to talk about. Better to endure in silence, to let their words bounce off her like arrows off a shield wall. The musicians struck up a new tune, and couples began forming on the central floor for dancing. Young men approached young women with shy smiles and outstretched hands. Mothers pushed their daughters forward with meaningful looks. The complex dance of courtship played out before her, a world she could observe but no longer join. She watched Ingrid Fairhair, once her closest friend, accept an invitation from Olaf the merchant's son. They had planned to be each other's maid of honor, had spent countless afternoons discussing what their weddings might be like. Now Ingrid's eyes slid past Freya as if she were part of the furniture. The isolation cut deeper than any blade. Freya had prepared herself for anger, for accusations, even for outright hostility. But this silent erasure of her existence proved harder to bear. She had become a ghost, haunting her own life. Movement caught her eye, a figure approaching through the crowd with purposeful strides. Tall beyond measure, shoulders broad as a doorframe, wearing a cloak that had seen far more battles than celebrations. Hrolf Thundertamer moved through the press of bodies like a ship cutting through waves, other guests stepping aside without conscious thought. His reputation preceded him into every room. 20 years of raiding across the Whale Road, from the green shores of Ireland to the spice markets of Constantinople. They said he had fought beside kings and outlaws alike, that his war cry could freeze the blood of enemies before his axe ever found their necks. The scars that crisscrossed his hands and forearms told stories of 100 battles, each mark a testament to his survival. But it was his eyes that caught Freya's attention, grey as winter storms, but holding a warmth that seemed at odds with his fearsome reputation. When he looked at her, she felt truly seen for the first time in months. "Mind if I sit?" His voice carried the roughness of someone who had shouted orders over the clash of steel and crash of waves. Before she could answer, he had settled onto the bench beside her, his presence immediately changing the atmosphere around their table. The whispered conversations behind them ceased, as if cut by a sword. "You don't want to sit here," Freya said quietly, not meeting his eyes. "It will do your reputation no good. My reputation has survived worse things than sharing a bench with a beautiful woman." He signaled to a serving girl, who hurried over with obvious nervousness. "2 horns of your finest mead, and be quick about it." "I'm not beautiful," Freya replied, finally looking at him directly. "I'm marked by shame." "There's a difference, is there?" Hrolf studied her face with the intensity of a warrior assessing an opponent. "I see intelligence in your eyes, strength in the way you hold yourself despite everything they've put you through. That looks like beauty to me." The serving girl returned with their mead, setting the horns down with trembling hands before scurrying away. Hrolf raised his horn in a toast. "To those who endure what they shouldn't have to." Freya hesitated, then lifted her own horn. The mead was honey-sweet on her tongue, warming her throat and chest. Around them, she could feel the weight of watching eyes, the buzz of speculation beginning to build. "Why?" she asked simply. "Why what? Why risk being seen with me? You've been gone for years. You could have any woman in this hall. Why choose the one person who can only bring you trouble?" Hrolf was quiet for a long moment, watching the dancers spin and weave through their intricate patterns. "Maybe I understand something about being marked by the past. Maybe I know what it feels like to carry weight that isn't entirely your own." There was something in his tone that suggested deeper currents, hidden wounds that matched her own. But before she could pursue the thought, the music changed to a slower melody, and he stood with fluid grace. "Dance with me." It wasn't a request. Freya shook her head. "I can't. People will talk regardless." He extended his hand, calloused palm upward. "At least give them something interesting to discuss." Her heart hammered against her ribs as she stared at his outstretched hand. To take it would be to step back into the light, to claim a place she had lost. But it would also paint a target on both their backs. "This is madness," she whispered. "The best things usually are." Against every rational thought in her head, Freya placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers with surprising gentleness, and he led her toward the dancing space. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as they passed. She felt the weight of every gaze in the hall, heard the collective intake of breath as the crowd processed what they were seeing. Hrolf placed one hand at her waist, the other still holding hers, and suddenly they were moving together to the ancient rhythm. He was surprisingly graceful for such a large man, leading her through the steps with confidence born of many celebrations in foreign courts. "Breathe," he murmured as they turned. "You're doing fine. Everyone is staring. Let them. Some sights are worth staring at." Despite everything, Freya found herself almost smiling. The music swept them along, and for a few precious moments, she felt like herself again, not the disgraced niece of a traitor, but simply a woman dancing with a man who looked at her as if she mattered. When the song ended, Hrolf didn't immediately release her. They stood there in the center of the floor, surrounded by whispers and wide eyes, and she realized that something fundamental had shifted. Whether for better or worse remained to be seen. "Thank you," she said quietly. "The evening is still young," he replied. "And I suspect we've only just begun to give them something to talk about." As they returned to their table, Freya caught sight of the silver wedding goblet being passed among the high table once more. But for the first time all evening, she didn't feel its absence quite so keenly. Perhaps belonging came in many forms, and perhaps she had just discovered a new one. The hall had grown quieter as the evening deepened, though the undercurrent of whispered speculation about Hrolf and Freya's unexpected partnership hummed like distant thunder. They sat together now, no longer strangers sharing a bench, but something altogether more complicated. Hrolf had draped his battle-worn cloak across her shoulders when the night air began seeping through the hall's stone walls, the heavy wool still carrying the scent of salt spray and distant lands. The cloak felt like armor against the stairs, its weight both protective and possessive. Dark blue-grey wool lined with fox fur, it bore the subtle marks of its travels, a small burn mark from an enemy's torch, a carefully mended tear that spoke of close calls and narrow escapes. To wear it was to carry a piece of his story, and Freya found herself drawing comfort from its familiar weight. "Tell me about the eastern markets," she said, needing to fill the silence with something other than the awareness of how closely they sat. "I've heard the spices there can preserve meat through the longest winters." Hrolf's eyes lit with genuine interest. "Constantinople's markets are like nothing you've ever imagined. Streets that stretch for miles, filled with merchants from lands so distant their names sound like songs. I once saw a man trading in silk so fine it felt like captured moonlight. You speak like a poet, not a warrior. Can't a man be both?" His smile carried hints of mischief. "Though I'll admit poetry doesn't pay as well as the business end of an axe." Their conversation was interrupted by approaching footsteps. Jarl Eric Goldbeard himself approached their table, his face flushed with mead and something less pleasant. Behind him followed Thorstein the Bitter, whose own family had profited from the redistribution of Freya's uncle's lands. Hrolf Thundertamer. Eric's voice carried the false heartiness of a man trying to maintain civility while delivering a blow. "I didn't expect to see you at our humble celebration. Who'd thought you'd be halfway to Greenland by now, chasing your next fortune?" Hrolf remained seated, though Freya could feel the tension coiling in his muscles like a cat preparing to spring. "Eric, good to see prosperity agrees with you. That's quite a belly you've grown since I left." The Jarl's face darkened, but he forced a laugh. "Always had a sharp tongue, didn't you? Though I wonder if your wit extends to your choice of companions." His gaze fell on Freya like a physical weight. "Some associations carry consequences, and some Jarls talk too much after their third horn of mead," Hrolf replied, his voice dropping to a register that made nearby conversations falter. "Perhaps you should return to your high table before you say something that requires an answer." The challenge hung in the air between them like smoke from a funeral pyre. Freya's heart hammered against her ribs. This was exactly what she had feared, her presence dragging others into conflicts they didn't deserve. "Hrolf," she began quietly, "perhaps I should stay exactly where you are." His hand found hers beneath the table, fingers intertwining with surprising gentleness. "We were having a pleasant conversation." Eric's face had gone from red to purple. "You would defend the niece of a traitor, a woman whose very name is poison in decent company? I would defend anyone who deserves defending." Hrolf rose slowly, unfolding to his full, impressive height. "And I wonder what decent company you think you're keeping, Eric, considering the lands you were so quick to claim when Bjorn fell." The accusation hit its mark. Thorstein stepped forward, hand moving instinctively toward his belt knife. "Careful, Thundertamer. That sounds dangerously close to an accusation, does it?" Hrolf's smile held no warmth. How interesting that you would hear it that way. The confrontation might have escalated beyond words, but the bride's father chose that moment to call for attention. Thorvald Ironbeard's voice boomed across the hall, cutting through the tension like an axe through kindling. "Friends, before the night grows too late, let us hear from those who have traveled far to honor this union." The crowd turned toward the high table, giving Eric a graceful exit from the confrontation. But his parting words carried clear warning. "This isn't finished, Thundertamer. Some choices have consequences that echo longer than expected." As the Jarl and his companion retreated, Freya realized she was trembling. Not from fear, but from the strange, overwhelming sensation of having someone stand for her. When had anyone last considered her worth defending? "You shouldn't have done that," she whispered as Hrolf settled beside her again. "Eric Goldbeard is not a man to cross lightly. Neither am I." His hand still held hers, thumb tracing gentle circles across her knuckles. Besides, someone needed to remind him that land stolen in the wake of another's fall doesn't make for secure ownership. Freya studied his profile as he watched the speakers at the high table. There were depths to this man she was only beginning to glimpse, currents that ran far beneath his reputation as a simple warrior. "You knew my uncle." It wasn't a question, and Hrolf didn't pretend otherwise. "I knew of him. Freya Ljosdottir was respected when I left for the eastern raids. What happened during my absence, it came as quite a shock. Everyone says the evidence was overwhelming. Evidence can be arranged, if one has the right connections and sufficient motivation." He turned to look at her directly. "Did you believe he was guilty?" The question hit her like a physical blow. For months, she had pushed such doubts aside, accepting her uncle's guilt as the price of moving forward. But in the darkness of sleepless nights, questions had gnawed at her like hungry wolves. I don't know," she admitted. "Uncle Bjorn was many things. Proud, sometimes harsh, certainly ambitious. But a traitor? A man who would sell grain, meant to feed soldiers defending our lands." She shook her head. "It never felt right." "Trust that feeling," Hrolf said quietly. "A woman's intuition about family often sees truths that men's logic misses." Before she could respond, the evening's entertainment reached them. A traveling skald had risen to recite an epic poem about ancient heroes, his voice weaving tales of love and betrayal, honor and redemption. But Freya found herself more interested in the man beside her than in stories of distant glory. "Why are you really doing this?" she asked when the skald paused for refreshment. "This, whatever this is between us." Hrolf was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of careful truth. "Because sometimes the loneliest people recognize each other across a crowded room. Because you looked like someone who needed a friend. Because acting like I'm with you doesn't feel like acting at all." The honesty in his voice made her breath catch. Around them, the celebration continued. Laughter and music, the clink of cups and the shuffle of dancing feet. But in their small corner of the great hall, something fragile and precious was taking root. "People will expect explanations," she warned. "They'll want to know what your intentions are, whether this is serious or just a passing fancy." "And what would you like me to tell them?" "I don't know." She turned to face him fully, studying the scars that mapped his journey through countless battles. "What are your intentions, Hrolf Thundertamer? What happens when the evening ends and daylight forces us back to reality?" His free hand reached up to touch her cheek, fingers rough with calluses, but infinitely gentle. "Then we'll find out if what we're pretending tonight has any chance of becoming real tomorrow." The touch sent warmth racing through her, awakening feelings she had buried beneath months of grief and shame. When was the last time someone had looked at her as if she were precious? When had anyone's touch carried promise rather than pity? "This is dangerous," she whispered. "The best things usually are," he repeated his earlier words, but now they carried deeper meaning. "Question is, are you willing to take the risk?" Looking into his storm-grey eyes, Freya realized that the question wasn't whether she was willing to risk her heart. That decision had been made the moment she placed her hand in his and stepped into the light. The real question was whether she was brave enough to believe that someone might choose her not despite her shame, but without regard for it at all. "One more dance," she said finally, "before we decide what tomorrow might bring." This time, when they took the floor, Freya held her head high and met the stares directly. Let them whisper, let them speculate. For tonight, at least, she wasn't alone. Dawn crept over Jorvikstead like a cautious animal, pale light filtering through the smoke and mist that perpetually hung over the settlement. Freya woke in her small cottage with the memory of the previous evening wrapped around her, like Hrolf's cloak, which still lay across the chair where she had carefully placed it before sleep. The wool held his scent, a mixture of leather, steel, and something indefinably masculine that made her pulse quicken despite herself. She had expected to wake with regret, to find that daylight had burned away the magic of their unexpected connection. Instead, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months: anticipation. The feeling made her nervous. Freya dressed carefully in her second-best dress, a deep green wool that brought out the color of her eyes. She had sold most of her finer garments to pay her uncle's debts, but this one she had kept, a reminder of who she had been before shame became her constant companion. As she braided her long blonde hair, she caught herself wondering if Hrolf would find her beautiful in ordinary daylight. Without the forgiving flicker of torches, the cottage felt smaller this morning, its simple furnishings and sparse decorations highlighting how far she had fallen from her previous station. Where once she had lived in the Jarl's hall with servants and comfort, now she made do with a single room, a small garden, and the charity of neighbors who remembered her family's former kindness. A knock at her door made her heart skip. Surely it was too early for visitors, unless someone had come to deliver unpleasant news about last night's public association with a known warrior. She opened the door cautiously, then blinked in surprise. Hrolf stood on her threshold, looking impossibly large in the morning light. He had clearly taken time with his appearance. His dark hair was neatly braided, his beard trimmed, and he wore a clean tunic beneath a leather vest that spoke of quality craftsmanship. In his hands he held something that made her breath catch. "I believe this belongs to you," he said, offering her his cloak. "You didn't need to return it personally," she managed, though her fingers tingled as they brushed his while taking the garment. "Perhaps not. But I wanted to ask if you'd walk with me to the market this morning. I find myself in need of supplies, and I suspect you know the best merchants." Freya stared at him, confusion warring with hope. "The market? In daylight? Where everyone will see us together? That is generally how markets work, yes." His smile held gentle humor. "Unless you prefer conducting your business under cover of darkness? But last night I thought—" She struggled to find words for her assumptions. "I thought when the evening ended, so would our arrangement." Hrolf stepped closer, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "What we shared last night wasn't an arrangement, Freya. At least not for me." "Was it for you?" The directness of the question left her momentarily speechless. In her experience, men, especially warriors, preferred indirect approaches to matters of the heart. But Hrolf seemed determined to meet every challenge head-on, including this one. "I don't know," she admitted. "I'm not sure I know how to tell the difference anymore." "Then let's find out together." He offered his arm with the same confidence he had shown the night before. A simple walk to the market. No pretense, no performance for an audience. Just two people getting to know each other in daylight. Against her better judgment, Freya found herself accepting his arm. The solid warmth of him beside her felt reassuring as they stepped into the morning air. Jorvikstead was already alive with activity, merchants setting up their stalls, children running errands for their mothers, craftsmen beginning their daily work. The first few people they encountered merely nodded politely, but as they walked deeper into the settlement's heart, Freya became aware of the ripple effect their presence created. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Women looked up from their looms with sharp interest. Men stopped their work to watch them pass. "They're staring," she murmured. "Let them. I'd rather be stared at than ignored, wouldn't you?" The observation struck her with unexpected force. For months she had craved invisibility, had tried to blend into shadows and avoid notice. But wasn't being ignored simply another form of exile? At least being stared at meant she still existed in their world, even if as an object of curiosity. They stopped at Gunnar the silversmith's stall, where the craftsman displayed his wares on tables covered with rich fabric. Hrolf examined several pieces with the eye of someone accustomed to quality goods. But it was a simple carved bone comb that caught his attention. "This is beautiful work," he said, lifting the comb to catch the light. The bone was polished to a soft gleam, carved with intricate knotwork patterns that spoke of hours of patient craftsmanship. "My daughter made that one," Gunnar said proudly. "She's just begun learning the craft, but she has skilled hands." Hrolf turned to Freya with the comb in his palm. "Your hair is too beautiful to be contained by ordinary pins. This deserves something special." Before she could protest, he was negotiating with Gunnar for the price. The silversmith's eyes flicked between them with barely concealed interest. Here was gossip that would spread through the market before the sun reached its zenith. "You shouldn't," Freya said quietly as Hrolf counted out silver coins. People will think I appreciate beauty when I see it." He handed her the comb with a smile. "And they'll be right. The simple gift felt precious beyond its modest value. When had anyone last given her something beautiful simply because they wanted to?" The bone was warm from his touch, and she found herself tracing the carved patterns with her fingertip. "Thank you," she said, meaning far more than the words conveyed. They continued through the market, and gradually Freya began to notice a change in how people responded to her. Where before she had received cold shoulders or outright avoidance, now she found herself included in conversations, asked her opinion on goods, treated with a respect she had nearly forgotten. It wasn't that Hrolf's presence somehow erased her family's disgrace, but his obvious regard for her seemed to give others permission to remember her worth. Like a stone dropped in still water, his acceptance created ripples that touched every interaction. "It's strange," she said as they paused at a spice merchant's stall. "I feel like myself again, like the person I was before everything changed." "Perhaps," Hrolf said thoughtfully, "you're discovering that the person you were never really went anywhere. She was just waiting for the right moment to emerge again." The spice merchant, an elderly woman named Thora, looked up from measuring out precious saffron threads. "Freya, dear, it's good to see you looking well. That green brings out your eyes beautifully." The casual kindness in her voice nearly brought tears to Freya's eyes. Thora had been one of the first to turn away after her uncle's disgrace, but now she spoke as if no time had passed, as if shame had never driven a wedge between them. As they left the market, arms laden with purchases and hearts lighter than they had been in months, Freya realized that something fundamental had shifted. Whether this change would last beyond Hrolf's interest remained to be seen, but for now, she was content to simply walk beside him and remember what it felt like to belong somewhere again. 3 days had passed since the market visit, and what had begun as a single morning's experiment had quietly evolved into something resembling routine. Hrolf appeared at her door each day with some excuse. He needed guidance, finding the best leather worker, or he wanted her opinion on fabrics for a new cloak, or he claimed to be curious about the old stone circle that stood on the hill overlooking the settlement. This morning found them sitting among those ancient stones, sharing bread and cheese, while the autumn sun painted the valley below in shades of gold and crimson. Freya had brought him here partly to escape the constant scrutiny of the town, but mostly because this place held special meaning for her, and she found herself wanting to share it with him. "My grandmother used to bring me here when I was small," she said, running her fingers over the worn surface of the largest stone. Carved symbols covered its face, so weathered by centuries of wind and rain that their meaning had been lost to all but the most learned scholars. She said these runes told the story of the first settlers, of how they chose this place for their home. Hrolf studied the markings with genuine interest. "Can you read them?" "Some." Freya traced one symbol with her fingertip. "This one means journey. This represents safe harbor, and this, she paused at a more complex carving, this is the rune for new beginning. Your grandmother taught you to read the old writing. She taught me many things. Languages, history, the healing properties of herbs. Freya's voice carried both pride and sadness. She said knowledge was the one treasure that could never be stolen. Even when everything else was lost, the fragment of runestone lay partially buried at the base of the ancient monument, a piece that had broken away decades ago but was too heavy to remove. Freya had discovered it as a child and had made it her private treasure, a tangible connection to the ancestors who had walked this land before her. She sounds like a wise woman, Hrolf said. I would have liked to meet her. She would have liked you, I think. She always said that true strength showed itself not in how hard a man could strike, but in how gently he could touch what mattered to him. The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Hrolf's eyes found hers, and she saw something there that made her heart race. Not the casual interest of a man passing time, but something deeper and more dangerous. Tell me about your travels, she said quickly, needing to shift away from the intensity of the moment. You mentioned Constantinople. What was it like, really? Hrolf leaned back against the stone circle, his gaze turning distant, like a dream made of marble and gold. Streets so wide you could march an army down them, buildings that reached toward the sky like prayers made solid. But it was also a place where a man could lose himself completely if he wasn't careful. Is that what happened to you? Did you lose yourself? He was quiet for so long that she wondered if she had overstepped some invisible boundary. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of carefully guarded truths. For a while, yes. When you spend years fighting other men's battles for other men's gold, you start to forget what you're fighting for yourself. I became very good at being what people needed me to be, warrior, sellsword, enforcer. But I stopped being me. What brought you back? A letter. His smile held no humor. News from home that reminded me I had ties to this place, responsibilities I had been avoiding. Sometimes you have to travel to the edge of the world to remember where you belong. Freya sensed layers of meaning beneath his words, currents she couldn't quite read. What kind of responsibilities? The kind that involve old debts and older loyalties. He turned to face her fully. What about you? Before your uncle's fall, what did you dream of doing with your life? The question caught her off guard. For months, her world had narrowed to simple survival, to enduring each day without bringing further shame to her family name. She had almost forgotten that there had been a time when the future held possibilities beyond mere endurance. I wanted to be a healer, she admitted, like my grandmother. She taught me which herbs could ease pain, which teas could bring down fever, how to set a broken bone so it would heal straight and strong. I was good at it. People trusted me. They could trust you again, not after, she gestured vaguely, encompassing all the weight of her family's disgrace. Because your uncle was accused of treason, your hands forgot how to heal? Hrolf's voice carried gentle challenge. Because his name was blackened, your knowledge became worthless. You don't understand. In a place like this, reputation is everything. Who would trust their child's fever to the niece of a traitor? Someone whose child was sick enough that they cared more about getting help than about politics. He reached over and took her hand, fingers intertwining with hers. Your worth isn't determined by what others did or didn't do. Freya, it's determined by who you choose to be. The simple touch sent warmth racing up her arm, and she found herself leaning closer to him, almost without conscious thought. The autumn air carried the scent of wood smoke and dying leaves, but all she could focus on was the steady strength of his presence beside her. You make it sound so easy, she said. Nothing worthwhile is easy. But that doesn't mean it's impossible. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the settlement below them go about its daily business. From this distance, the people looked like toys moving through carefully arranged scenes, their individual dramas and conflicts reduced to manageable proportions. Can I ask you something? Freya said eventually. Anything. That first night, At the wedding feast, you said you understood something about being marked by the past. What did you mean? Hrolf's hand tightened slightly on hers, and she saw something flicker across his features. Not quite pain, but something close to it. We all carry scars, Freya. Some are visible. Like these, he gestured to the marks on his sword arm. Others are harder to see, but cut just as deep. The trick is learning to live with them without letting them define everything you become. It wasn't a complete answer, but she sensed it was all he was prepared to give for now. Everyone had secrets, wounds too tender to expose to daylight. She could respect that, especially when his presence was helping her heal wounds of her own. "Thank you," she said simply. "For what?" "For reminding me that I'm still here. Still myself, underneath everything else." He lifted their joined hands and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "You never stopped being yourself, Freya. You just forgot how to let others see it." The challenge came on a crisp morning, when frost still silvered the grass and breath misted in the cold air. Freya was tending her small garden, harvesting the last of the late herbs before winter claimed them, when she heard the commotion from the direction of the practice yard. Shouts and the ring of steel on steel carried on the wind. But there was something different about these sounds, less playful than the usual morning training, more urgent. She straightened, brushing dirt from her hands, and saw a crowd gathering near the center of town. Her heart began to race as she recognized the tension in people's postures, the way they clustered together like sheep sensing wolves nearby. This was not the relaxed gathering of those watching friendly competition. Freya hurried toward the disturbance, her woolen cloak pulled tight against the morning chill. As she drew closer, she could make out individual voices raised in anger, and her blood chilled as she recognized one of them. "Think you can waltz back into Jorvikstead and claim what doesn't belong to you?" Magnus Bloodaxe stood in the center of a loose circle, his face flushed with rage and early morning ale. The man was a veteran warrior whose best years lay behind him, but whose pride had only grown sharper with age. Some of us remember what loyalty means. Facing him with deadly calm stood Hrolf, completely relaxed despite the naked aggression radiating from his opponent. His hands hung loose at his sides, but Freya could see the coiled readiness in his stance, a predator allowing prey to exhaust itself before striking. "And what exactly do you think I'm trying to claim, Magnus?" Hrolf's voice carried the patient tone of someone addressing a child, throwing a tantrum. "Don't play the fool with me." Magnus spat, gesturing wildly with one thick arm. "Everyone knows why you've come back. Everyone sees how you parade around with that traitor's niece, acting like you own the place." The words hit Freya like physical blows. So this was about her. Her presence had finally drawn Hrolf into the kind of conflict she had feared from the beginning. She pushed through the crowd, desperate to reach them before violence erupted. "You think taking up with damaged goods makes you some kind of hero?" Magnus continued, his voice growing louder as he played to his audience. "Or maybe you just like your women already broken, easier to manage that way." The insult hung in the air like the scent of blood, and Freya saw something dangerous flicker across Hrolf's features. His stillness became absolute, the kind of terrifying quiet that preceded storms. "You have something to say about my choice of companions?" Each word fell like a blade on stone. "I'm saying a man is known by the company he keeps." Magnus drew his practice sword, the blunted steel catching the morning light. "And I'm saying some company isn't fit for decent folk." "Then perhaps," Hrolf said with deadly softness, "you should choose your words more carefully." Freya broke through the front rank of spectators just as Magnus raised his sword. "Stop!" she called out, her voice cutting through the tension. "Please, both of you, this doesn't need to happen." Magnus turned his sneer toward her. "Ah, the lady herself, come to watch your protector defend your honor? Assuming you have any left to defend." The cruel laughter that followed his words stung worse than any physical blow. Freya felt her cheeks burn with humiliation, but before she could retreat, Hrolf stepped between them like a mountain shifting into place. "You seem to have forgotten your manners." Magnus, his hand moved to rest on the pommel of his very real, very sharp sword. "Perhaps I should remind you of them. You think that reputation of yours frightens me?" Magnus sneered. though his voice carried less certainty than before. "I've killed men before you were born, and I've killed more men than you've shared ale with." Hrolf's matter-of-fact tone made the threat even more chilling. "But if you insist on testing which of us remembers the lessons better, I'm happy to oblige." The crowd fell silent, sensing they were witnessing something far more serious than a simple disagreement. Freya could feel the weight of dozens of eyes upon her, could practically hear the wheels turning as people calculated the social implications of what was unfolding. Then, and cutting through the tension like a war horn, came a voice that made everyone freeze. "What is the meaning of this disturbance?" Jarl Eric Goldbeard approached with measured steps, his own warriors flanking him. His expression carried the careful neutrality of a leader who knew that how he handled this moment would ripple through the community for months to come. Magnus immediately straightened, lowering his sword. "My lord, I was merely expressing concern about certain influences that have returned to our community." Eric's gaze moved from Magnus to Hrolf to Freya, calculating quickly. "Influences? This man," Magnus pointed his sword toward Hrolf, "thinks he can return after years away and immediately claim a place among us. Worse, he flaunts his association with those who have brought shame upon our town." A murmur ran through the crowd at this bold statement. Freya felt her stomach twist with nausea. Magnus was forcing Eric to take sides publicly, to either support or condemn her presence. "Is that so?" Eric's voice revealed nothing of his thoughts. "And what exactly makes you believe Hrolf Thundertamer needs anyone's permission to be here?" The question caught Magnus off guard. He had clearly expected the Jarl to support his position, not question his authority to challenge Hrolf. "My lord, surely you see the danger in—" "What I see," Eric interrupted smoothly, "is a man disrupting the peace of my town based on gossip and speculation." His eyes fixed on Magnus with cold intensity. "Tell me, when did you become the arbiter of who belongs in Jorvikstead?" The public rebuke hit Magnus like a slap. His face went from red to white as he realized he had overplayed his hand badly. I merely thought—" "You thought incorrectly." Eric's tone carried finality. "Hrolf Thundertamer is a warrior of proven reputation who has brought honor to our community through his deeds. If he chooses to spend time with Freya Ljosdottir, that is his decision to make." The Jarl's words were carefully chosen, supporting Hrolf without actually defending Freya, maintaining political balance while defusing the immediate crisis. But Freya caught something else in his expression. A flicker of calculation that suggested this confrontation served his purposes in ways she didn't yet understand. Magnus sheathed his sword with obvious reluctance. "Of course, my lord. I spoke hastily." "Yes," Eric agreed coldly. "You did. Perhaps you should spend some time considering the wisdom of speaking before thinking." As the crowd began to disperse, Freya felt Hrolf's hand settle on her shoulder, not possessive, but protective. The gesture was small, but its meaning was clear to everyone watching. The messenger arrived 3 days after the confrontation with Magnus, his horse lathered with sweat and his face grim with the weight of urgent news. Freya first noticed the commotion from her cottage window, the sound of hoofbeats at full gallop, followed by shouts and the horn blast that summoned the town's leaders to emergency council. She had been grinding herbs with her mortar and pestle, preparing the winter medicines that people would need in the months ahead. Despite Magnus's public humiliation, word of her healing knowledge had begun to spread quietly through the community. A farmer's wife had come seeking a remedy for her husband's persistent cough. A mother had asked for a salve to ease her teething child's pain. Small steps toward reclaiming the role she had lost, but progress nonetheless. The bloodied messenger's scroll bore the royal seal, its red wax pressed with the king's own ring. Freya recognized it from the terrible day when a similar message had arrived, announcing her uncle's charges and demanding his immediate arrest. Her hands trembled as she set down her work, memories flooding back with painful clarity. Within an hour, the news had spread through Jorvikstead like wildfire. Danish raiders had struck 3 settlements along the northern coast, burning homes and seizing hostages. But this was no ordinary raid. The attacks showed signs of inside knowledge, of someone who knew exactly where the grain stores were hidden, which houses held the most valuable goods. When the local warriors would be away on hunting expeditions, the pattern was chillingly familiar. It was exactly what her uncle had been accused of, providing information to enemies in exchange for gold. Freya found Hrolf at the blacksmith's forge, where he had been having his sword examined for winter maintenance. The weapon lay across the anvil, its steel gleaming despite the scars of countless battles. But it was his expression that caught her attention, the careful mask of someone processing unwelcome information. "You've heard the news," she said. It wasn't a question. News travels fast in a small town. He picked up his sword, testing its balance with automatic precision. "Especially news that confirms people's worst suspicions. They're already saying it proves my uncle was guilty," Freya said quietly. "That if the Danes are still getting inside information, it must mean his network of traitors is still active. And what do you think?" The question was gentle, but she heard the deeper concern beneath it. Hrolf was asking not just for her opinion, but testing whether she would be swayed by popular sentiment or hold to her own convictions. "I think," she said carefully, "that it's convenient how the raids follow the same pattern that condemned my uncle." "Almost too convenient," Hrolf's eyes sharpened. Meaning that if someone wanted to ensure my uncle's guilt was never questioned, they would need to provide ongoing evidence that his network was still operational. What better way than to stage raids that match his supposed crimes? It was a dangerous theory, one that suggested deliberate conspiracy rather than simple, ongoing treachery. But as Freya spoke the words aloud, they felt increasingly right. The timing, the methods, the convenient confirmation of existing suspicions, it all felt orchestrated. "That's a serious accusation," Hrolf said quietly. "Not an accusation, a suspicion. But one that makes more sense than believing my uncle built such an extensive spy network that it continues to function months after his death." They were interrupted by approaching footsteps. Jarl Erik appeared in the forge's doorway, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes alert with purpose. "Hrolf, I was hoping to find you here." His gaze flickered to Freya, acknowledgement without warmth. The king's messenger brought more than just news of raids. "There are additional concerns that require discussion." The carefully formal tone warned of serious business. Freya began to step away, recognizing the signs of a conversation she wasn't meant to hear. But Eric's next words stopped her cold. "Actually, this involves you as well. Freya, perhaps you should hear this directly rather than through gossip and speculation." Her stomach clenched with familiar dread. Nothing good ever came from being included in the Jarl's official discussions. Erik moved closer, lowering his voice, despite the relative privacy of the forge. "The messenger brought word that the king is sending investigators to examine the recent raids. But their mission extends beyond simple inquiry. They've been ordered to look into any remaining connections to Freya Ljosdottir's network." "What does that mean?" Freya asked, though she suspected she already knew. "It means they'll be questioning anyone who might have had contact with your uncle's operations. Family members, close associates, anyone who might have knowledge of how his system worked." The implication hung heavy in the air. As Bjorn's only surviving relative, Freya would be their primary target for questioning. And given her recent public association with Hrolf, they might well assume he was involved as well. When? Hrolf's voice carried deadly calm. "Within the fortnight. Perhaps sooner." Eric's expression remained carefully neutral. "I thought you both should know so you could prepare appropriately." "Prepare how?" Freya asked. "That depends on whether you have anything to hide," Erik replied. "If your uncle truly was guilty of treason, and if you had no knowledge of his activities, then you have nothing to fear from honest investigation." But his tone suggested he knew the situation was more complicated than simple innocence or guilt. Royal investigators were not known for their subtlety or their interest in nuanced truth. They would be looking for quick, decisive answers that satisfied their superiors, and if those answers required finding new scapegoats, so be it. And if the investigation concludes there are still active traitors? Hrolf asked. Then justice will be swift and final, Eric replied grimly. The king cannot afford to appear weak in the face of continued betrayal. He will demand examples be made. After the Jarl left, Freya and Hrolf stood in heavy silence. The blacksmith had withdrawn to the far end of his workshop, giving them privacy while maintaining the pretense of working. I should leave, Freya said finally. Disappear before they arrive. It would be safer for everyone. Running would only confirm their suspicions, Hrolf pointed out. And where would you go? How would you survive? I survived before. You endured before. There's a difference. His hand found hers, fingers intertwining with familiar warmth. Besides, I don't intend to let you face this alone. Hrolf, you don't understand. If they connect you to me, if they decide you're part of some conspiracy, then we'll deal with that when it happens. His voice carried absolute certainty. I'm not abandoning you now. The simple declaration should have brought comfort, but instead it filled her with a different kind of fear. She was falling in love with this man, had probably already fallen, and now her presence in his life might destroy him just as it had destroyed everything else she cared about. But as she looked into his storm-grey eyes, she saw no hesitation, no second thoughts. Whatever was coming, he intended to face it with her. The question was whether their growing bond could survive the storm that was approaching, or whether it would be torn apart by forces beyond their control. The truth came to her in the darkest hour before dawn, when sleep had finally claimed her restless mind and dreams carried messages that daylight logic would have rejected. Freya woke with a gasp, her heart hammering against her ribs as fragments of the dream clung to her consciousness like cobwebs. She had been standing in her uncle's hall as it had been before his fall. Rich tapestries on the walls, silver gleaming on the tables, the warm scent of prosperity and security. But in the dream, shadows moved wrong, and voices whispered secrets in corners where no one stood. And there, on the table where her uncle conducted his business, lay a document bearing a seal she recognized but couldn't quite place. The royal decree lay on her table now, retrieved from the hiding place where she had kept her uncle's few remaining possessions. The official parchment that had listed his crimes in precise legal language, bearing the king's seal and signed by the royal investigators. She had read it dozens of times, torturing herself with the weight of evidence against her family's honor. But now, in the pale light of early morning, she saw what her grief-stricken eyes had missed before. The seal was perfect, too perfect. The wax showed no cracks, no wear from travel, none of the minor imperfections that marked genuine royal documents. And the parchment itself, while expensive, lacked the distinctive watermark that marked official royal correspondence. Her hands shook as she studied the document more closely. The handwriting was skilled, the legal language precise, but there were subtle differences from the genuine royal documents she had seen in her uncle's legitimate business dealings. Small variations in letter formation, slight inconsistencies in the formal phrases that opened and closed official proclamations. This document was a forgery, an extremely skilled one, but a fake nonetheless. The implications crashed over her like a cold wave. If the royal decree was false, then her uncle's trial had been based on fabricated evidence. Someone had orchestrated his downfall with meticulous care, creating documents convincing enough to fool even the king's own representatives. But who had the skill to forge royal documents? Who had access to official seals and royal parchment? And more importantly, who had the authority to ensure that no one questioned the evidence too closely? The answer came to her with sickening clarity, and she had to grip the table's edge to steady herself. Only someone with intimate knowledge of royal procedures could have created such convincing forgeries. Only someone with access to the highest levels of government could have ensured the investigation proceeded. Without deeper scrutiny, only someone the king trusted completely could have betrayed that trust so thoroughly. Freya's mind raced through the implications. The recent Danish raids following her uncle's supposed methods weren't proof of his guilt. They were continuation of the same conspiracy that had destroyed him. Someone was still feeding information to enemies, still profiting from betrayal, and using her uncle's disgrace as cover for their ongoing treachery. She had to tell Hrolf, had to share this discovery and figure out what it meant, how they could use it, whether it was even safe to possess such knowledge. But as she reached for her cloak, a sound outside made her freeze. Footsteps, multiple sets, moving with the deliberate rhythm of armed men trying to be quiet. Through her small window, she could see torches moving in the pre-dawn darkness, converging on her cottage with purposeful intent. The royal investigators had arrived early. Panic shot through her as she realized the trap she was in. Here she stood with evidence of royal document forgery in her hands, about to be questioned by men who might well be part of the conspiracy themselves. If they found the forged decree, if they realized she had discovered the truth, she would never live to share what she had learned. The footsteps stopped outside her door. A heavy fist pounded against the wood with unmistakable authority. "Open, in the name of King Harold." Freya's mind worked frantically. She couldn't destroy the document. It was the only proof of her uncle's innocence. But she couldn't let them find it either. In desperation, she rolled the parchment tightly and slipped it inside her bodice, the formal seal pressing cold against her skin. "Coming!" she called, wrapping her cloak around her shoulders and struggling to compose her features. When she opened the door, 3 men stood in her threshold. 2 soldiers in royal livery and a third man whose expensive robes and calculating eyes marked him as the chief. Investigator, Freya Ljosdottir, the robed man said without preamble. "I am Ragnar the Truth-Seeker, here on King Harold's direct orders. You will come with us for questioning regarding treasonous activities." "I've done nothing wrong," she managed, proud that her voice remained steady. "That will be determined through proper investigation." His smile held no warmth. "Gather whatever you need for an extended stay. You won't be returning home until we're satisfied with your answers." Extended stay. The words chilled her blood. She had heard whispers of what happened to those taken for extended questioning by royal investigators. Many never returned at all. As she gathered a few belongings with trembling hands, her mind worked desperately. She needed to get word to Hrolf, needed him to know what she had discovered. But how could she communicate with him when she was about to be locked away under guard? The answer came as they escorted her through the settlement's quiet streets. She caught sight of a familiar figure in the shadows near the blacksmith's forge, Hrolf, watching their procession with carefully controlled rage. Their eyes met for just a moment, and she made a subtle gesture toward her chest, hoping he would understand that she carried something important. The message seemed to reach him. "Because," he gave an almost imperceptible nod before melting back into the shadows. They brought her to a heavily guarded building near the center of town, a stone structure that had been hastily converted into a makeshift prison and interrogation center. The walls were thick, the windows barred, and the door secured with iron locks that spoke of serious preparation. "Make yourself comfortable," Ragnar said as they locked her into a small, windowless cell. "We'll begin our discussion once the sun rises, and my mind is fresh for such important work." The threat in his tone was unmistakable. This would not be a gentle questioning, but an interrogation designed to extract whatever answers they wanted to hear. Regardless of their relationship to truth, alone in the darkness, Freya pressed her back against the cold stone wall and tried to think. The forged decree still lay hidden against her skin, its presence both a comfort and a terrible danger. She possessed proof of a conspiracy that reached to the highest levels of power, but she was trapped, helpless to act on that knowledge. Worse, she realized with growing horror that Hrolf might be walking into the same trap. If the investigators decided he was part of her supposed network, they would arrest him next. And if he tried to help her escape or challenge their authority, he would only confirm their suspicions of his guilt. The conspiracy that had destroyed her uncle was tightening around them both, and she could see no way to escape its coils. All she could do was hope that Hrolf would understand the danger in time, that he would find some way to use the truth she had discovered before it was too late for both of them. Outside her cell, She could hear the investigators settling in for their work. Soon, they would begin the process of extracting whatever confession they needed to satisfy their superiors and close this case permanently. Unless something changed dramatically, dawn would bring the beginning of the end for any hope of justice or survival. The irony was bitter beyond words. She had finally discovered the truth that could clear her family's name and expose the real traitors. But she was powerless to act on that knowledge, trapped by the very conspiracy she had uncovered. All she could do was pray that Hrolf would prove as resourceful as his reputation suggested, and that somehow, against all odds, the truth would find a way to emerge from the shadows where it had been buried. Hrolf spent the hours after Freya's arrest in careful preparation, moving through Jorvikstead's shadows like the ghost his old comrades had once called him. The message she had conveyed with that subtle gesture to her chest told him everything he needed to know. She had discovered something important, something hidden, something that changed everything about their situation. But first, he needed allies. And that meant revealing truths he had hoped to keep buried until the time was right. The old sword felt familiar in his hands as he lifted it from its hiding place beneath the floorboards of his rented room. This was not the battle-scarred weapon he wore openly, but something far more significant, a blade forged in the royal workshops, its pommel bearing the mark of the Thundersworn, the elite guard who served directly under the king's command. Hrolf Thundertamer was not just a wandering warrior who had returned home. He was Captain Hrolf Eriksson of the Thundersworn, sent by King Harald himself to investigate the treasonous activities that had plagued the northern settlements. His mission: determine whether Freya Ljosdottir's network truly was dismantled or if other conspirators remained hidden in positions of trust. The irony was bitter beyond words. He had been ordered to investigate the very woman he had fallen in love with, to determine if she posed a threat to the realm's security. Instead, he had discovered that she was as much a victim as anyone else, and that the real conspiracy ran far deeper than anyone suspected. His first stop was the cottage of Thorvald the Wise, the settlement's eldest member, and a man whose memory stretched back to the founding of Jorvikstead. If anyone would know the truth about old loyalties and hidden connections, it would be him. The ancient man received him without surprise, as if he had been expecting this visit. His eyes, still sharp despite his years, studied the royal sword with knowing recognition. "So," Thorvald said quietly, "the king finally sent someone who knows how to look beneath the surface." "Took him long enough." "You knew?" Hrolf asked. "Boy, I've been watching the comings and goings in this settlement for 70 years. You think I wouldn't notice when someone starts asking the right questions instead of accepting convenient answers?" The old man gestured for Hrolf to sit. "The real question is, what do you plan to do about what you've learned?" "That depends on what you can tell me about the night Bjorn was arrested." Thorvald's expression grew grim. "Dark business, that. Too neat, too clean. Evidence appeared like snow in summer, sudden and complete. But the strangest thing was how quickly certain people moved to claim his lands and position, Eric Goldbeard, among others. But Eric was just the most obvious beneficiary. There were others who gained from Bjorn's fall, trade agreements that shifted, alliances that reformed, debts that were conveniently forgiven. The old man's eyes sharpened. "Tell me, Captain, have you considered who had the authority to make all those arrangements happen so smoothly?" The implication hit Hrolf like a physical blow. He had been so focused on the obvious suspects that he had missed the deeper truth. Someone with administrative authority, someone who could expedite legal transfers and official approvals. Someone trusted enough that their word wouldn't be questioned. "Ragnar, the truth-seeker," he said quietly. "Now you're thinking like an investigator instead of a warrior," Thorvald approved grimly. "That man has been the king's chief investigator for 15 years. How many convenient discoveries do you think he's made in that time? How many cases has he solved by finding exactly the evidence needed to satisfy his superiors?" The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. If Ragnar was corrupt, If he had been manufacturing evidence and eliminating threats for years, then dozens of cases might be tainted. Dozens of innocent people might have died for crimes they never committed. I need proof, Hrolf said. Then you'd better move fast. Word is that Freya Ljosdottir will confess to her crimes by sunset tomorrow. Apparently, the investigation is proceeding faster than expected. The threat was clear. Ragnar intended to extract whatever confession he needed and close this case permanently. There would be no trial, no opportunity for appeal, just a quick execution to tie up loose ends and satisfy royal justice. Hrolf's next stop was the blacksmith's forge, where he found Eric Goldbeard examining weapons with the careful attention of a man preparing for conflict. The Jarl looked up as Hrolf approached, and something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, calculation, and perhaps a hint of fear. Hrolf, I heard about the arrest. Unfortunate business, is it? Hrolf let his hand rest casually on his sword hilt. Or is it exactly what someone wanted to happen? Eric's expression grew cautious. I'm not sure what you're implying. I'm implying that some people have profited remarkably well from recent tragedies. Land acquisitions, trade agreements, convenient partnerships with neighbors who were once competitors. Hrolf stepped closer. Makes a man wonder if those tragedies were as unexpected as they seemed. The Jarl's face hardened. Be very careful with your accusations, Thundertamer. Some words can't be taken back, and some actions can't be undone. Hrolf's voice dropped to deadly quiet. The question is, are you part of the problem or part of the solution? For a long moment, they stared at each other in tense silence. Then Eric seemed to reach some internal decision. What do you want to know? Everything. Starting with what really happened the night the evidence against Bjorn was discovered. Eric glanced around the forge, ensuring they were alone, then spoke in carefully measured tones. The documents appeared in Bjorn's chambers during a search I wasn't allowed to witness. Ragnar insisted on conducting it personally, with only his own men present. When they emerged, they had everything needed to prove treason, and you accepted this without question. I accepted it because questioning a royal investigator's methods is a good way to find yourself under investigation. Eric's voice carried bitter honesty. But yes, I had doubts. Bjorn was many things, but he was no fool. If he were truly running a spy network, he wouldn't have left evidence lying around like breadcrumbs. So why didn't you speak up? Because dead men tell no tales, and I had no desire to join Bjorn in the grave. Eric met his eyes directly. But if you're planning what I think you're planning, you'll need more than suspicions and moral outrage. What would I need? A way to prove Ragnar's corruption that doesn't rely solely on the word of people he could easily discredit. Eric paused. And a plan that doesn't get everyone involved executed for treason against the king's chosen representative. Hrolf nodded grimly. The Jarl was right. They needed irrefutable proof and a way to present it that wouldn't result in their immediate deaths. But time was running short, and Freya's life hung in the balance. There might be a way, Eric continued slowly, but it would require considerable risk from everyone involved. Explain. Ragnar keeps his personal documents in a locked chest in his temporary quarters. If those documents include correspondence with his Danish contacts, or records of payments received for information provided, they would constitute proof even the king couldn't. Ignore. You're talking about breaking into a royal investigator's private chambers and stealing official documents. I'm talking about recovering evidence of treason, Eric corrected. The fact that such evidence happens to be in Ragnar's possession merely indicates the depth of his betrayal. It was a desperate plan, fraught with dangers that could destroy them all. But as Hrolf considered their alternatives, he realized they had no choice. Freya would not survive tomorrow's interrogation unless they could provide dramatic proof of her innocence and Ragnar's guilt. How do we get access to his chambers? Leave that to me, Eric said grimly. I may have profited from Bjorn's fall, but I'm not without conscience. If that man was innocent, if I helped destroy an honorable family through my silence, then I owe his niece whatever aid I can provide. They spent the remaining daylight hours in careful planning, mapping guard rotations and timing their approach for maximum effectiveness. As the sun set over Jorvikstead, painting the sky in shades of blood and fire, Hrolf felt the familiar tension that preceded battle, but this would be a different kind of warfare. Not the honest clash of steel against steel, but a shadow conflict where truth and lies battled for supremacy, and where the wrong move could doom everyone he cared about. Somewhere in the stone building that served as Ragnar's headquarters, Freya waited in darkness, holding secrets that could change everything. Tomorrow would bring either vindication or destruction, and the margin for error was vanishingly small. Hrolf touched the pommel of his ancestral sword, drawing strength from its familiar weight. The Thundersworn had sworn oaths to protect the innocent and serve justice, even when that justice required defying those who claimed authority in its name. Tomorrow, he would discover whether those oaths meant anything when tested by fire. The assembly horn sounded at dawn, its deep voice echoing across Jorvikstead, and summoning every free person to witness what Ragnar proclaimed would be the final resolution of the treason investigation. The great mead-hall had been transformed into a makeshift court, with the truth stone of the assembly moved from its traditional place in the center of town to a position of honor before the high table. The ancient stone bore the weight of centuries, its surface worn smooth by countless hands that had touched it while swearing oaths or speaking testimony. Carved runes around its base proclaimed the sacred nature of truth-telling, warning that lies spoken in its presence would bring down the wrath of the gods themselves. No one in living memory had dared to speak falsehood before the truth stone. The consequences were believed to be too terrible to contemplate. Freya stood between two guards, her hands bound, but her spine straight with defiant dignity. The night of imprisonment had left marks on her, shadows beneath her eyes, a pallor that spoke of fear and sleepless hours, but her spirit remained unbroken. She had managed to keep the forged decree hidden, despite thorough searches, and she prayed that Hrolf had understood her signal and found a way to act on what she had discovered. Ragnar, the truth-seeker, sat in the place of honor, his expensive robes and carefully groomed appearance marking him as a man of authority and refinement. But Hrolf, watching from the crowd, could see the subtle signs of tension in the investigator's posture, the slightly too rigid shoulders, the way his eyes kept flickering toward the exits, the careful positioning of his personal guards around the hall. People of Jorvikstead, Ragnar's voice carried easily through the packed hall. We gather today to conclude a matter of vital importance to the security of our realm. The woman before you stands accused of continuing the treasonous activities begun by her uncle, of providing aid and comfort to enemies of the crown. A murmur ran through the crowd. Many faces showed uncertainty rather than conviction. The evidence presented had been serious, but doubts lingered about its completeness and timing. However, Ragnar continued with theatrical gravity, justice requires that all truth be revealed before judgment is passed. Therefore I call upon any who possess knowledge relevant to this case to speak now, before the truth stone, in the presence of gods and witnesses. It was a standard legal formula, rarely invoked because few people dared challenge royal investigators. But Ragnar's confident smile suggested he expected no surprises. After all, who would dare contradict the king's own representative? Hrolf stepped forward, his movement creating a ripple of recognition through the crowd. The royal sword at his side caught the morning light streaming through the hall's windows, its polished steel and distinctive pommel marking it as something far more significant than a simple warrior's weapon. I have knowledge relevant to this case, he declared, his voice carrying the authority of absolute conviction. Ragnar's expression shifted subtly, confidence flickering as he recognized something dangerous in Hrolf's demeanor. You may speak, but remember that false testimony before the truth stone carries severe penalties. I am well aware of the penalties for lies, Hrolf replied, moving to stand beside the ancient stone. As I am aware of the penalties for treason against the crown. He drew his sword in one fluid motion, But instead of threatening anyone, he placed its point against the truth stone's surface in the ancient gesture of oath-binding. The crowd gasped as they recognized the ritual. This was no casual testimony, but a formal invocation of the god's judgment. "I am Hrolf Eriksson, captain of the Thundersworn, sent by King Harald himself to investigate treasonous activities in the northern settlements." His voice rang through the hall like a bell. "I swear by this stone and by my oath to the crown that the words I speak are truth." The revelation hit the assembly like a physical blow. Ragnar's face went white as he realized the trap that was closing around him. A captain of the Thundersworn outranked any investigator, and his testimony would carry weight that even royal authority could not easily dismiss. "The woman Freya Ljosdottir is innocent of all charges," Hrolf continued, his voice gaining power with each word. "Her uncle Bjorn was the victim of conspiracy, not its architect. The true traitor stands among us now, hiding behind stolen authority and forged documents. This is preposterous." Ragnar sputtered, rising from his seat. "You have no proof of these wild accusations." "Don't I?" Hrolf's smile held no warmth. Eric Goldbeard approached the truth stone. The Jarl stepped forward, carrying a leather satchel that he placed carefully beside the ancient stone. "I present evidence recovered from the chambers of Ragnar the Truth-Seeker, correspondence with Danish agents, records of payments received for information provided, and detailed plans for future raids." The assembly erupted in shocked murmurs as Eric opened the satchel and began displaying its contents. Letters bearing Danish seals, detailed maps marking weaknesses in local defenses, and most damning of all, a ledger recording years of transactions that painted a clear picture of systematic betrayal. Ragnar's composure cracked completely. "Those documents are forgeries. This is a conspiracy to undermine royal authority. Then you won't object to having them examined by experts?" Hrolf asked mildly. "After all, if they're false, the truth will be easily established." But everyone present could see the guilt written across Ragnar's features, could read the desperation in his increasingly frantic denials. The evidence was overwhelming, and his reaction only confirmed what the documents revealed. The crown of winter thorns sat upon a wooden pedestal beside the truth stone, its twisted metal catching the morning light in a way that seemed almost alive. The ceremonial headpiece was ancient beyond memory, worn only during the most solemn moments of justice when a community's judgment carried the weight of divine sanction. Its presence transformed the assembly from a simple hearing into something approaching a trial by ordeal. Ragnar's eyes fixed on the crown with obvious horror. He knew, as everyone present knew, that whoever wore it during the rendering of judgment would be bound by sacred oath to speak only absolute truth. More than that, the crown was said to compel honesty from its wearer, making deception physically impossible while it rested upon their head. "This is madness." Ragnar backed away from the pedestal as if the crown were a living serpent. "I am the king's appointed representative. You have no authority to subject me to provincial rituals." "Actually," Hrolf said calmly, his hand still resting on his sword hilt, "as a captain of the Thundersworn investigating treason against the crown, I have considerable authority, including the right to invoke ancient laws when royal representatives are suspected of corruption." The crowd pressed closer, sensing they were witnessing something that would be spoken of for generations. Old Thorvald stepped forward from among the elders, his voice carrying the weight of decades. "The law is clear," he pronounced. "When accusations of this magnitude are made against one who claims royal authority, the accused may prove their innocence by wearing the crown of winter thorns and speaking their truth before the assembly." "And if they refuse?" Eric Goldbeard asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Then their guilt is considered proven beyond doubt," Thorvald replied grimly. Ragnar's face cycled through expressions of rage, fear, and desperate calculation. His guards had moved closer to him, but they were outnumbered and faced with a crowd whose mood was turning increasingly hostile as the implications of the evidence became clear. I demand trial by combat," Ragnar declared suddenly, "as is my right under royal law." Combat against whom? Hrolf asked. You stand accused by the king's own captain, backed by physical evidence and sworn testimony. Who exactly do you propose to fight? The question hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Trial by combat required a clear accuser willing to risk their life on the truth of their claims. But Ragnar faced not one man, but an entire community united in judgment. I call upon my right to face my primary accuser, Ragnar said desperately, drawing his own sword with trembling hands. You, Hrolf Eriksson, if you truly believe these lies, then prove it with steel. The challenge sent a ripple of excitement through the crowd. Combat between a royal investigator and a captain of the Thundersworn would be a battle worthy of songs, regardless of its outcome. But Hrolf shook his head slowly. You mistake the nature of your situation, Ragnar. I'm not your accuser. She is. He gestured toward Freya, who stood with growing understanding of what was being offered to her. The choice was hers to make. Accept the formal vindication that others would provide, or claim the right to face her tormentor directly. The law allows for champions, Eric pointed out. Freya Ljosdottir could name Hrolf as her representative in combat. She could, Hrolf agreed. But that is her decision to make. All eyes turned to Freya as she stepped forward, the crowd parting before her like water before a ship's prow. The guards moved to stop her, but Hrolf's quiet gesture made them hesitate long enough for her to reach the truth stone. I have something to say, she declared, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed hall. Before any blood is shed in my name, let all truth be revealed. With careful deliberation, she reached inside her bodice and withdrew the forged royal decree that had condemned her uncle. The parchment crackled as she unfolded it, its false seals and lying words exposed to the light for all to see. This is the document that destroyed my family, she said, holding it high. But it is a forgery, created by someone with access to royal materials and knowledge of official procedures. The assembly erupted in shocked exclamations as people pressed forward to examine the evidence. Even without expert knowledge, many could see the subtle signs that marked the document as false once they knew what to look for. Ragnar made one final desperate gambit. That proves nothing. Anyone could claim forgery after the fact. Could they? Freya asked with quiet dignity. She lifted the crown of winter thorns from its pedestal, its metal cold against her palms. Then let me wear this crown and swear to the truth of what I've discovered. Let the gods themselves judge whether my words are honest. The gesture was unprecedented. No one in living memory had voluntarily donned the crown while making accusations of such magnitude. But as Freya placed the twisted metal upon her head, a hush fell over the assembly that seemed to carry divine weight. I swear by the truth stone and this sacred crown that the man who calls himself Ragnar, the truth-seeker, is a traitor to the crown he claims to serve, she declared, her voice ringing with absolute conviction. I swear that he forged the evidence against my uncle and has been feeding information to Danish raiders for years. I swear that justice demands his crimes be exposed and punished according to law. The words seemed to hang in the air with supernatural force, and everyone present felt the weight of divine judgment settling over the assembly like morning mist. The crown of winter thorns had accepted her testimony, and with it, the truth could no longer be denied. 6 months after the assembly that changed everything, Freya stood in the doorway of her cottage and watched the morning sun paint Jorvikstead in shades of gold and amber. The settlement looked much the same as it always had. But the quality of light seemed different now, warmer, more welcoming, free of the shadows that had once made every corner feel like a place where whispers might hide. The cottage itself had been transformed. Where once sparse furnishings and careful poverty had marked her reduced circumstances, now comfort and prosperity spoke of a life rebuilt. Rich tapestries covered the walls, gifts from families whose children she had healed during the long winter months. Silver vessels gleamed on her shelves, some inherited from her uncle's restored estate, others purchased with the generous compensation the king had provided when the truth of Ragnar's conspiracy came to light. But the most precious addition to her home sat Upon the mantel above her hearth, 2 rings forged from melted-down metal that carried the history of both their families. The gold had come from her grandmother's wedding band, carefully preserved through all the dark months. The silver had been taken from Hrolf's captain's talk, the symbol of his service to the Thundersworn. The blacksmith had worked the metals together with patient skill, creating something entirely new from the remnants of their separate pasts. The rings would be blessed today, in a ceremony that would unite not just 2 people, but 2 families, 2 histories, 2 futures that had found their way to each other through the darkest of times, having second thoughts. Hrolf's voice carried gentle humor as he approached from the direction of the settlement's center. He wore his finest clothes, a tunic of deep blue wool embroidered with silver thread, leather breeches that fit him like a second skin, and a cloak that spoke of quality without ostentation. But it was his expression that made Freya's heart skip, the look of a man who had found exactly where he belonged. "Never," she replied, reaching for his hands. "Though I still can't quite believe this is real." "It's real," he assured her, lifting her fingers to his lips. "As real as the fact that Ragnar, the truth-seeker, or rather, Ragnar the traitor, met his end on the execution block 3 months ago. As real as your uncle's restored honor and your family's vindicated name." The weeks following the assembly had moved with the swift efficiency of royal justice properly applied. Ragnar's confession, extracted under the weight of overwhelming evidence, had revealed the scope of a conspiracy that reached back nearly a decade. Dozens of cases were reopened, innocent people posthumously cleared of charges, and a network of corruption rooted out from the highest levels of the kings. Administration King Harald himself had travelled to Jorvikstead to personally oversee the restoration of Freya Ljosdottir's reputation and to ensure that his niece received not just compensation but royal recognition for her role in exposing the truth. The ceremony had been simple but profound. The broken seal ring that had once symbolized her family's disgrace was replaced with a new one, bearing the king's personal blessing and a guarantee of his protection. The children from the eastern settlement should arrive by midday, Freya said, adjusting the herbs hanging from her cottage's rafters. Her practice as a healer had not just resumed, but flourished, with people traveling from distant communities to seek her skills. "Young Bjorn's fever broke yesterday, but I want to make sure the lung sickness doesn't return. You named him after your uncle. His parents did, actually. Said they wanted their son to carry the name of an honorable man." Freya's voice carried quiet satisfaction. "It seems the truth has a way of spreading just as quickly as lies once it's given the chance." They walked together toward the great mead-hall, where their wedding feast awaited. The same building where Freya had once sat alone and forgotten, now buzzed with preparation for a celebration that would unite the entire community. Tables groaned under the weight of food and drink, musicians tuned their instruments, and flowers gathered by the settlement's children decorated every surface. "Any regrets?" Freya asked as they paused at the hall's entrance. "You could have had any posting in the kingdom after exposing Ragnar's conspiracy. The king offered you command of the Thundersworn, governorship of major settlements, wealth and position beyond imagining, and instead I chose to marry a stubborn healer in a small northern settlement," Hrolf replied with a grin. "Clearly I've lost my mind completely. Clearly. Besides," his expression grew more serious, "I spent 20 years serving other people's dreams, fighting other people's battles, building other people's fortunes. It's time I focused on something that's mine." "Ours," she corrected. "Ours," he agreed, and the word carried the weight of promise, of shared futures and intertwined destinies. The ceremony itself was simple but profound, conducted by the settlement's eldest priest before an assembly that included everyone who had witnessed their first public dance months ago. As they exchanged the rings forged from their combined histories, Freya felt the last shadows of her uncle's disgrace finally lifting from her shoulders. "With this ring," Hrolf said, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed hall, "I bind my life to yours, my honor to yours, my future to yours." "With this ring," Freya replied, I offer my heart, my strength, my healing hands, and all the love I have to give. When their lips met in the kiss that sealed their union, the cheer that rose from the assembled guests seemed to shake the very rafters. But for Freya, the sound faded into background noise as she lost herself in the arms of the man who had seen her worth when the world had written her off as worthless. Later, as the celebration continued around them and the sun set over Jorvikstead, they stood together on the same hill where the ancient stone circle marked the place of new beginnings. The rings on their fingers caught the last light of evening, symbols of a love that had grown from pretense into something real and lasting. "So," Hrolf said, pulling her close against the evening chill, "what happens now?" Freya smiled, thinking of the children who would need healing, the herbs that would need gathering, the life they would build together in this place that had become truly home. "Now," she said, "we begin."